What's going on, guys? My name is Matt, and recently I gave myself the challenge of putting together a gaming PC for only $200. Now, this was definitely a ton of work, but the end result is a system that plays almost any game you throw at it at 1080p 60 FPS and can even stream pretty well to sites like Twitch, which is something I'll be testing in this video. Now, normally for PC builds, I like to buy each individual component, but for a build this cheap, sometimes the best option is to buy an existing system and upgrade it to fit your needs, and that's exactly what I set out to do. After scouring eBay listings for a few days, I ended up finding this one here. This is a listing for a Dell Optiplex 9010 with an i7 CPU, 8GB of RAM, and a few extras. The price was pretty good, so I ended up bidding and winning the auction for about $56 plus shipping. Unfortunately, the shipping was about $30, making the total cost of the base system $86. With that being said, I knew I could actually get that cost to go down, which I'll explain more of what I mean by that in a minute. So after submitting my payment, I waited and eventually had this brown box land on my doorstep. The box was nondescript and in good condition, which is great to see that it was handled with some amount of care while en route to me. Opening it up, I found the system itself wrapped in a bunch of bubble wrap and nothing else in the box other than more packing material. Pulling out the system, I found a pretty dirty Optiplex with a bag taped to the top. In the bag was a wireless keyboard and mouse that came included with the system. Now, while I don't need these for this build, I do have a plan for them. What I decided to do was try and sell these along with any other parts from the base system I wasn't going to use in an attempt to offset the overall price. See, if I paid $86 for the system and sold the unused parts for $20, that would effectively make the net cost $66 instead, opening up more room in the budget. I think this is a super good idea in a situation like this where you're trying to get the absolute most value possible. Now, I have had comments in the past saying this is cheating, but in my viewpoint, as long as the net cost of the system is under the set budget, then it's fair game. But I'm interested to hear your perspective on this in the comments down below. Looking at the system itself, the outside was pretty dirty and slightly beat up, and other than the standard Optiplex stickers, there were a few from the business that previously owned this, including this one, and one that says property of Ambarella. Ambarella is a fabulous semiconductor design company based in California, and while this isn't really pertinent information for this build, it does give us some insight into the story and life that the system previously lived. With that being said, I made sure to remove this and add my own sticker to let everyone know what's up. Before cracking it open and doing anything, I wanted to turn it on and make sure the system booted up and was recognizing the hardware. Pressing the power button and success, it booted right into BIOS and everything was being recognized correctly. With that done, I went ahead and powered it down so I could start investigating the internals. Opening up the side panel, I found pretty standard Optiplex components with the exception of one part which I'll talk about in a minute. Everything looked to be in good physical condition, but there was a healthy layer of dust draped across most of the components, which to be honest was to be expected. I next decided to tear it down to take a closer look at each of the components and decide what I was going to keep and what I was going to get rid of or sell. First, I unplugged and pulled out the power supply, undid some cables, removed the GPU, then the back fan, and finally the motherboard, which I left one cable connected to until I could get a better look at how it unclipped. One thing to note when messing with these OEM systems is that many of these cables have proprietary clips like the USB 3 that you don't find on standard motherboards, meaning if you try to pull this out like a normal USB 3 cable, you would likely rip the header out with it. So now that everything's out, let's look at the components in the base system and talk about what's staying and what's going. Pulling off the cooler and wiping off the old thermal paste, we reveal the CPU, which was one of the big selling points of this system. The CPU in question is the i7 3770. This is a 4-core, 8-thread CPU running on Intel's Ivy Bridge architecture. Its base and boost clocks are 3.4 and 3.9 GHz respectively, which is decent for this CPU's age. Speaking of age, the CPU is actually 10 years old at this point, but don't let that fool you. For a cheap budget gaming system like this one, the i7 3770 still works great. It definitely doesn't compare to even modern budget CPUs, but for playing esports titles and most AAA titles at low settings, the CPU works very well. You could probably even get away with some light video editing and even streaming, which again is something I tested. I could technically sell this CPU and buy a comparable Xeon from the same era, but I really would only recoup about $5, which having to deal with both buying and selling wouldn't really be worth the time invested. In terms of cooling this i7, I'm just using the basic Optiplex cooler that came with the system. This is a basic LGA 1155 cooler, and it's just a big hunk of aluminum with a fan attached. With that being said, it still works great for cooling this CPU, and if you're interested in temps, make sure to stick around to the benchmark section of the video. In terms of the motherboard that came with this system, this is an OEM Dell LGA 1155 Micro ATX board. It's super basic, but has stuff like back panel USB 3, plenty of PCIe expansion, and supports all the parts I wanted to use. One other nice thing is the fact that unlike a lot of OEM boards, this one uses standard power connectors for both the 4-pin CPU and 24-pin motherboard connector. This means we can ditch the power supply that came with the system and upgrade it to something much nicer and with more power headroom. This is important because the vast majority of graphics cards worth throwing in here require more power and more connections than the stock power supply can support. Because of all this, keeping the motherboard was a no-brainer. In terms of RAM, the system came with two 4GB sticks of Samsung DDR3 running at 1600 MHz. 8GB is decent for a budget gaming system, but even with this kit installed, there was still room for two more sticks of memory, so if budget allowed, I wanted to throw in two more 4GB sticks for 16GB total, which would be awesome. Because of this, it meant I was definitely keeping the RAM that came with it and possibly was going to add more. Next, let's talk about the case. This Dell Optiplex is obviously using a Dell Optiplex case. I think this honestly looks pretty decent. It holds all the parts, has decent airflow, and spending 40 or 60 bucks on another case just doesn't make much sense in this budget, so I decided to keep it and save the money to be used in other parts of the build. So I think I've covered all the parts that are staying. Now let's talk about what's going. First off is the included GPU. This system came with an NVIDIA GT640. This is a PNY variant with 1GB of DDR3 video memory, and while this card is okay in a lot of esports titles, it really doesn't give us the performance we're looking for. Beyond this card can fetch $20 to $30 on sites like eBay, which again would decrease the net cost of the system. Next thing I'm selling is the power supply. Like I said earlier, this has got to go, and just like the GPU, this can be worth selling as it can go for between $15 to $20 on eBay. Not really sure why someone would want this OEM power supply over a standard one, but hey, I'm happy to get rid of it if someone's happy to buy it. Finally, I wanted to sell the keyboard and mouse that came with this. These, I wasn't entirely sure if I could get anything for them, but I thought it was worth a try. So before gathering other parts, I wanted to sell these and see how much of the budget I could free up. I began by listing both the graphics card and power supply on eBay and locally through a few sites. I actually ended up selling everything locally. I probably could have got more money for these parts, but I wanted a quick turnaround so I could proceed with the video. For the GPU, I had listed it for $25, someone offered $15, and we ended up settling for $20. The power supply I listed locally for $15 and accepted an offer for $10. Finally, I ended up selling the mouse and keyboard as a bundle to a friend for $5. After doing all this, I was able to convert these unused parts into a pile of cash I could use for other parts in the build. Pile of cash might be a bit hyperbolic, but the $35 I did get ended up making the net cost of the system $51, meaning I had $149 left for the rest of the build. This was great as all I really needed to add was a graphics card, power supply, storage, and possibly more RAM. For the power supply, I went for a pretty safe pick, which is the Asus TUF Gaming 550. This is a very highly rated 550 watt 80 plus bronze unit. It goes on random sales sometimes, and I was able to pick this one up for $35. This isn't the most amazing deal ever, but it's still really good value and is key in unlocking the full potential of this build. It's non-modular, but it has black sleeve cables which look great, and the system's using a solid side panel, so how the internals look isn't super important. Next up is storage. SSDs are super cheap right now. This, along with the fact that game sizes are getting larger and larger every year, it means fitting a 500GB SSD in a build like this is not only feasible, but kind of a necessity in my opinion. After looking at a few options, I basically went for the cheapest 500GB SATA SSD I could find, which is the Silicon Power A550. It's super basic, but for $33 with Prime shipping, it fits into the build and the budget very well. 500GB should be more than enough for your OS, applications, and a decent number of games. Again, this SSD is very much a budget offering, but it's miles better than a mechanical hard drive in my opinion. With the SSD purchased, I now was down to $82 left in the budget. When looking at GPU options, I pretty much instantly knew which card I wanted to use. See, a month or so ago, I bought this quote-unquote broken RX 580 8GB for just $65 on eBay. It was a very odd listing and overall an interesting experience, so I made a full video on this card, which I'll link in the description. Spoiler alert, this card does function fine, which is amazing because $65 for an 8GB RX 580 is a steal in my opinion. The RX 580 is 5 years old at this point, but is still a great 1080p graphics card with plenty of video memory to keep up with modern games. Now yes, the i7-3770 in this build is holding this card back, but at the end of the day, in a super cheap budget build like this one, compromises and bottlenecks are going to happen and is something to be expected. I did change the thermal paste on this card, and again, temps will be in the benchmark section of the video. With the card secured, it meant I had used $183 of the $200 budget, leaving $17 left over. After looking at eBay, I was happy to see DDR3 prices have dropped dramatically in the past year or so. In a couple minutes, I found a listing for a 1600 MHz 2x4GB kit of DDR3 for only $12 with free shipping. This is a Micron kit, so it's not an exact match with the Samsung sticks that are currently installed, but I knew it was probably going to work out fine and hit the buy it now button. After purchasing that, I just had a measly $5 left in the budget, which I figured would cover stuff like new thermal paste and other miscellaneous stuff like cable ties. So with all the parts gathered, I could begin assembling the final system. I started by installing everything into the motherboard, including the CPU, the cooler, and the RAM. I put in and screwed down the motherboard into the case, installed some cables, threw in the fan, installed the power supply, then came to a very sad realization when I went to install the graphics card, which is that it was too long. The hard drive cage was keeping it from fitting, so I decided to remove it. This required me to drill out a bunch of rivets and then basically pry out the cage itself. I didn't need this cage because I was going with flash storage, but I still recommend getting a shorter card and not removing the cage because even with the cage gone, I ended up giving up multiple SATA ports and front panel USB 3, which were covered by the end of the card. So again, if you're doing an Optiplex build like this one, just buy a short card and make your life much easier. With that figured out, I could finish assembling and neatening up the build until I was left with this, the final product. A sub $200 gaming PC with a quad-core i7, RX 580, 16 gigs of RAM, and a 500GB SSD. It doesn't look amazing, but again, the goal here was just pure performance for the lowest price possible. With the PC build, all that was left to do was install and benchmark games, so without further ado, here's how this system performs in gaming. As you can see, for $200, this system performs pretty darn well. You can see in many instances the old i7 holding back our RX 580, but again, that was totally to be expected. Temps were a little warm, but still well within my comfort zone. The final thing to talk about is streaming. I tested streaming Valorant and Borderlands 3 to Twitch at 1080p 30fps. There definitely was a dip in performance in both of these games, but the end result was an enjoyable experience on both my end and the stream end. So yes, this $200 system can actually stream, which is pretty awesome in my opinion. Overall, I consider this challenge a complete success, but I'm interested to hear what you guys think of it and if you would have switched out any different parts in the comments below. I think this wraps this video up. If you enjoyed it, make sure to give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing. Oh, and as always, this is Matt from Tech by Matt, signing out.